The Seine lay silent beneath a gray August sky. Morning light crept across the bridges of Paris, touching stone that had stood for centuries, arches older than empires, towers that had survived revolutions, plagues, and kings. But on this morning in 1944, those same stones hid a secret that could erase everything they had ever seen. Beneath Pont Neuf, a German engineer tightened the final knot on a bundle of explosives. He worked without speaking, the fuse cords coiled like snakes through the shadows. Every bridge across the river, from Pont de l'Alma near the Eiffel Tower to the ornate Pont Alexandre III, was wired in the same way. If the order came, the Seine itself would become a wall of flame and rubble. At the center of it all, in a suite inside the Hôtel Meurice on Rue de Rivoli, a man sat at a desk covered in maps. The maps showed power stations, railway yards, gas mains, the Louvre, Notre-Dame, each marked in red pencil, each labeled with the same word, demolition, destroy. A telephone rested beside the maps. Its ring had become the sound every officer in Paris feared. When it came, the voice on the other end was unmistakable, sharp, impatient, metallic. It was the voice of Adolf Hitler. He asked a single question that would echo through history. Brennt Paris? Is Paris burning? To the man holding the receiver, General Dietrich von Choltitz, the city's German military governor. That question was not a metaphor. It was an order. If he obeyed, 2 million civilians and 1,000 years of civilization would vanish by nightfall. If he refused, he would sign his own death warrant. That morning, every bridge, every cathedral, every monument in Paris sat on the edge of annihilation. The fate of the city, and of everything it represented, rested in the hands of one man who had spent his entire life learning to follow orders. And yet, over the next 24 hours, that man would do something no one in Hitler's empire was supposed to do. He would say no, quietly, deliberately, and at the risk of everything. A decision that would turn treason into mercy, disobedience into salvation, and keep the lights of Paris burning when the world expected darkness. The question isn't how Paris was liberated, it's why it wasn't destroyed. To understand that, we must begin with the order that nearly ended the city forever. In the first week of August 1944, the German army in France was collapsing. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and were surging east, rolling through the bocage toward the Seine. Within Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, maps bled red. Divisions that had once defended Europe now existed only as symbols on a wall. It was then that a new name appeared beside one city, Dietrich von Choltitz, Militärbefehlshaber von Paris, the military governor of Paris. He was summoned without ceremony, handed his orders, and given the kind of responsibility that comes disguised as honor. He was to hold the French capital as long as humanly possible, and if holding became impossible, he was to ensure its total destruction. The directive had already been drafted by Hitler himself and transmitted through the Wehrmacht's chain of command. Its language was precise, bureaucratic, almost sterile. If retreat is necessary, the city of Paris will not fall intact into enemy hands. All bridges, communication centers, and strategic buildings are to be demolished. To a staff officer, these were words on paper. To anyone who had ever walked the banks of the Seine, they were a death sentence. The German engineers in Paris received the order and began their work with mechanical obedience. At each bridge, they measured load points, calculated the exact weight of charges required to collapse stone arches into the river. In the catacombs beneath the city, they mapped out the power cables that fed hospitals, rail yards, and water plants. Convoys brought in crates stamped Sprengstoff, explosives, from depots around Versailles. Everything was methodical, mathematical, and terrifyingly possible. Von Choltitz arrived on August 7th, stepping off a train from Germany into a city he had never seen. He was a professional soldier, heavyset, precise, 48 years old, with the calm diction of a man raised inside the Prussian code of duty. He had fought in Poland, in Holland, in Russia. He had seen cities burned to rubble by his own guns. Paris, to him, was a new assignment. Not yet a symbol, not yet a conscience. His first act was to establish headquarters inside the Hôtel Meurice on Rue de Rivoli, a Baroque palace now turned fortress. The crystal chandeliers had been replaced by field telephones and maps. The mirrors reflected not guests, but officers pacing in fatigue-gray uniforms. Each day, reports flowed in. The Allies had crossed the Seine at Rouen. Leclerc's armored division was moving north from Chartres. The French resistance was stirring. And above every report, the same instruction echoed from the Führer Hauptquartier. No withdrawal, no surrender, no mercy. Von Choltitz understood what that meant. The code name for the demolition plan was simple: Operation Valkyrie. Paris. The Eiffel Tower, the bridges, the rail stations, all were assigned target numbers. If the order was executed, the heart of France would cease to exist in less than 6 hours. He signed the receipt confirming he had received the directive, but he never signed the schedule to carry it out. The order had been given, the charges were being placed, but the city itself was beginning to rise, and the uprising would force the general to decide whether he would be the destroyer or the protector of Paris. Paris had already been breathing unrest for weeks. Ration cards grew thinner, curfews grew stricter. Men and women who had once commuted by tram now watched columns of fuel-starved German trucks crawl through the boulevards like wounded beasts. The city's rhythm had been interrupted, but it had not stopped. Not yet. On August 18th to 19th, 1944, something changed that would alter the calculus in the Meurice. The Paris police, an institution many thought thoroughly collaborated, struck. They refused German orders. They hoisted tricolor flags. They walked out of stations and into the streets, and when they did, ordinary Parisians followed. Across neighborhoods, locals overturned tramcars to make barricades. Cobblestones were heaved into piles, scaffolding lashed across narrow lanes. Shops bolted and bolted again, then left doors open for fleeing civilians. Wireless sets relayed Allied broadcasts and resistance bulletins. Church bells were used as signals. Words passed from café to café like an electric current. The FFI, Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, had been organizing in cells for months. They were many things at once: factory workers with smuggled rifles, young students armed with more courage than training, veterans of Spain hardened into skirmishers. The sudden collapse of local policing and the shadow of Allied columns gave them the chance they needed. Uprising is not a single motion, but a chorus of small, coordinated violences. In the Latin Quarter, students seized university buildings. In the Marais, jails were targeted. In Belleville, barricades made from overturned trucks choked off German patrol routes. Snipers took positions in attics. Messages scrawled on walls told soldiers where to look and where to avoid. The resistance called for a general strike, and the city responded. Shops shuttering in sympathy, factories idling in defiance. For the German commander, these were not benign events. Uprisings drew attention, bright and volatile, and they exposed thinly held German positions across Paris. German engineers who had been busy mapping demolition points looked up and saw their lines of retreat becoming narrower by the hour. Bridges that had been slated for controlled demolition now sat beneath barricades, within range of makeshift explosives wielded by civilians. The clock had begun to run out. The uprising also brought another force into play, a political force that mattered as much as any gun: legitimacy. The resistance, which had spent the occupation cultivating its moral authority in secret, now claimed it openly. The transfer of control could not simply be a military matter. If Paris was to be liberated, it had to be liberated in a way that allowed the French to assert themselves, to reclaim government buildings, arrest collaborators, and present a city reborn on its own terms. That political pressure landed squarely on von Choltitz's desk. Reports came in at all hours: barricades at the Hôtel de Ville, the prefecture under siege, civilians massing in the streets chanting for freedom. German units reacted with local counterattacks, short, brutal, and largely ineffectual. Fuel shortages meant reinforcements would arrive slowly, if at all. The German position, once a fortress in theory, was fragmenting into pockets. And yet, the most dangerous element for Paris was not the scarcity of German troops. It was the militants' proximity to the sabotage teams. Engineers had already placed charges under several bridges and at strategic intakes for the city's power and water. The placement had been covert, in service tunnels, beneath stone buttresses, below service walkways. The network depended on communication. Implementation required a code word, a switch pulled, an officer's deliberate confirmation. As barricades went up and guns cracked in the narrow streets, a different kind of panic spread among the men tasked with destruction. When cities burn, they do so quickly and indiscriminately. Panicked troops, fanatical SS detachments, or rogue engineers could trigger a cascade. One unauthorized explosion could trigger a chain reaction across a line of primed bridges. That fear of the unpredictable, of militias or SS snapping the fuse in a moment of rage, pushed decisions up the chain of command until they reached the governor's desk. In those cramped hours, Paris started to behave like a living thing fighting for its life. Citizens who had been silent fell into patriotic bravery. Shopkeepers mixed ammunition with bread loaves, hiding rifles behind pastries. Women knitted camouflage nets and carried messages through alleyways. Clergy opened church basements to wounded. The city's institutions, hospitals, the press, municipal services, began improvisation on a heroic scale. Even on a practical level, the rising of Paris complicated demolition logistics. Bridges that had been counted on for timing and approach routes were now in the hands of partisans who could blow them early or deny access to German engineers trying to reverse their work. The Seine's banks, once reliable for clandestine routes, were, under the sun of barricade watch, host to snipers and sleeping trucks. Logistics failed when the people around them refused to cooperate. By August 20th, the uprising had become impossible to ignore. German radio channels buzzed with conflicting reports. Some units were attempting to suppress, others were holed up waiting for orders. The Meurice found itself receiving two kinds of messages simultaneously: orders to prepare demolition and reports that the city might erupt before it could be controlled. For von Choltitz, this meant his choices were no longer purely military. The consequences of demolition would be measured not just in tactical delay, but in the permanent destruction of a living metropolis, in civil deaths, in cultural obliteration, in the collapse of Paris as an administrative entity. Each option carried a moral weight, each promised a different history. As the city rose in arms, a quiet negotiator walked its corridors, a neutral who had spent the occupation building channels in which both sides could find face-saving solutions. He would now try to turn conversation into survival. Amid the barricades and blackouts, one man moved through Paris carrying neither weapon nor uniform. He wore a simple suit, carried a diplomat's briefcase, and held perhaps the only passport that allowed him to pass unchallenged through checkpoints that no longer recognized any authority. His name was Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul general in Paris. For 4 years, Nordling had lived between two worlds. Officially neutral, he had served as intermediary between the German command, the Vichy administration, and the fragments of the underground that called themselves the Resistance. He had arranged prisoner exchanges, delivered food to hospitals, and negotiated the release of detainees from Gestapo prisons. He was fluent in both French courtesy and German hierarchy, a man who could bow to a general at noon and drink with a partisan at dusk. When the uprising began, he understood before anyone else that Paris had reached the edge of something irretrievable. A single rash order, a demolition, a counterattack, a revenge massacre, could transform rebellion into annihilation. So on the night of August 19th, while gunfire cracked through the left bank, Nordling walked through the doors of the Hôtel Meurice to see the new German commander face to face. Von Choltitz received him politely but warily. He had been in Paris less than 2 weeks and already faced the collapse of every plan drawn in Berlin. Nordling explained the situation as clearly as he could. The resistance held key intersections. The population was armed, and the Allied columns were approaching. A pitched battle would not only destroy the city, it would destroy any German unit trapped inside. He proposed a truce. The Germans would confine themselves to specific zones, the resistance to others, until a political solution could be reached. Hospitals would be protected, civilians spared, and utilities preserved. For the next several nights, the two men met repeatedly, sometimes in Nordling's consulate, sometimes in the Meurice, sometimes in shadowed apartments where curtains stayed drawn. The tone was formal but tense. Von Choltitz spoke the language of orders and necessity. Nordling spoke the language of conscience and civilization. Both understood that beneath the courtesies lay a battle of definitions, what it meant to obey and what it meant to be human inside obedience. Nordling's argument rested on three pillars. First, that Paris had no military value worth its destruction. Its loss would not change the outcome of the war already decided in Normandy. Second, that history would remember the man who preserved it more than the one who obeyed orders to erase it. And third, that the moral cost, the slaughter of 2 million civilians and the annihilation of a cultural capital, would stain the conscience of whoever allowed it to happen. Von Choltitz listened, saying little. He had heard moral arguments before and seen them dissolve in artillery smoke on the Eastern Front, but he also understood the tactical truth in Nordling's words. Destruction would serve no purpose except vengeance. His superiors would call it necessity. The world would call it barbarism. And for the first time, the concept of duty that had defined his career began to bend. Outside, the negotiations bought time. Each hour Nordling spent in discussion was another hour in which bridges remained intact, and engineers received no final order. It was diplomacy as delay, conversation as sabotage. The very act of talking became resistance. In those quiet rooms, Nordling performed a kind of psychological siege. He reminded the general that every officer in history had faced a moment where obedience and judgment diverged, and that only one of those paths ever survived history's verdict. He never lectured, never threatened. He simply continued the conversation, night after night, while Paris trembled around them. By August 21st, both men understood that no agreement on paper would hold once the Allies arrived, but that each minute of restraint counted. Nordling had no illusions. The general could still decide to obey, but the seed had been planted, the possibility that not following an order might serve a higher discipline. To grasp the weight of Nordling's persuasion, we must know the man he was facing. The soldier who had learned his trade on fronts where mercy was weakness. To understand how Paris survived, you must first understand the man who held its life in his hands. Dietrich Hugo Hermann von Choltitz was born in 1894 in the eastern provinces of the old German Empire, a son of the Prussian officer class. His childhood was one of order and tradition, fencing lessons, horsemanship, and the unspoken certainty that obedience to command was not a choice but a birthright. He grew up in a household where discipline was as much a virtue as faith, and where the word of a superior was law. He came of age during the First World War and served as a young infantry officer in the trenches of the Western Front. There he learned two lessons that would mark him forever: that men die for orders they do not understand, and that war rewards not idealism, but endurance. When Germany fell in 1918 and the Kaiser's empire dissolved, Choltitz, like many professional soldiers, clung to the army as the only constant left in a world that had lost its hierarchy. During the interwar years, he remained in uniform through the thin ranks of the Reichswehr, the small, restricted force allowed by the Treaty of Versailles. He rose slowly, by competence rather than charisma, distinguished by his attention to procedure and his calm under pressure. When Hitler came to power in 1933 and began rearming Germany, officers like Choltitz found themselves swept back into prominence. They did not all share the dictator's ideology, but they shared his appetite for order and restoration. Many, like Choltitz, chose to serve the state rather than question it. By the time the Second World War began, he had become a staff officer in the 16th Infantry Division, leading troops in Poland and the Low Countries. He participated in the capture of Rotterdam in May 1940, an operation remembered less for its precision than for the devastation of its air raids. The German High Command called it a tactical victory. The world called it a tragedy. And though historians still debate his direct role, the association with the destruction of Rotterdam followed Choltitz for the rest of his life. On the Eastern Front, his reputation hardened. He commanded units during the Siege of Sevastopol in 1942, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. The city was annihilated by months of bombing and artillery fire. For his effectiveness, he received promotion to general. For what the campaign did to his perception of destruction, no one ever promoted or demoted him enough to change it. He had seen cities reduced to ash, not from ideology, but from the cold arithmetic of siege warfare. And yet, by 1944, even he began to see that the arithmetic no longer worked. Germany was losing, and the orders coming from Berlin had ceased to serve strategy. They served only vengeance. When Choltitz was appointed military governor of Paris in early August 1944, it was both a reward and a trap. The city had no real defensive perimeter, no armored divisions, and no hope of reinforcement. It was a symbol, a jewel in the Reich's crown, to be held or shattered depending on the Führer's mood. Choltitz knew this. He also knew what failure to obey meant in the Germany of 1944. By then, dozens of officers had been executed for hesitation, sabotage, or defeatism. The failed assassination attempt on Hitler the previous month had unleashed a wave of purges. Suspicion was a death sentence. So when the general took his seat in the Hôtel Meurice, he inherited not a command, but a dilemma. His predecessors had fled or been recalled. His orders were absolute, and the man issuing them had begun to treat disobedience as treason punishable by death, not just for the officer, but for his family. Choltitz was no idealist. He was a career soldier who had obeyed in Poland, Holland, Russia, and Italy. He believed in the discipline of hierarchy because it was the only structure he had ever known. But the ruins of Sevastopol and the meaningless slaughter on the Eastern Front had taught him something else, that obedience could become a form of cowardice, that there came a moment when a soldier had to decide whether duty still served any purpose beyond destruction. Now that moment had arrived. The question was whether the general who had spent 30 years learning to follow orders would find the strength to break them. From his headquarters, Choltitz would soon hear that telephone ring again. The same voice, the same command, repeated like a curse. On the morning of August 23, 1944, a coded message arrived at the Hôtel Meurice. It bore the seal of the German High Command and the unmistakable personal signature of Adolf Hitler. The directive was brief, absolute, and final. Paris must not fall into the hands of the enemy. If it does, the city will lie in ruins. The bridges are to be blown. The city is to be burned. Only rubble shall remain. No tactical justification accompanied it. No strategic reasoning explained it. It was an instruction of vengeance, a command for symbolic destruction, meant to punish a world that had turned against the Reich. By then, Hitler's world had shrunk to maps and illusions. He imagined armies that no longer existed, divisions that had been annihilated, victory in a war already lost. He could not accept that Paris, the city that had once surrendered to him without a fight, would now be taken back by the enemy intact. To him, the destruction of Paris would prove that Germany could still dictate reality, even in defeat. If he could not have the city, no one would. At the Meurice, von Choltitz read the order in silence. He placed it on the desk beside earlier memoranda marked urgent, top secret, execute immediately. Each one had carried the same essential demand: destruction. And each time he had found reasons to delay. He had already instructed his engineers to prepare but not detonate. Charges were placed under the bridges but left unarmed. Detonators were disconnected and stored separately. The city was, in theory, ready to die, but only if he chose to let it. When the field telephone rang, the voice that came through was sharp, distant, almost feverish. Hitler was on the line. He asked a question that was not a question at all. "Brennt Paris? Is Paris burning?" For a moment, the general said nothing. He looked out the window of the Meurice toward the Tuileries Gardens, where smoke from scattered fighting drifted through the trees. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower stood against the horizon, motionless, immense, indifferent. He could see no flames. He told the Führer that preparations were underway, that the bridges had been mined, that the engineers awaited final confirmation. It was not a lie. It was not the truth either. It was something between, a sentence designed to buy time. He hung up the receiver, exhaled, and stared at the map. The city beneath his command was no longer a military asset. It was a hostage. For the next 48 hours, the same message came again and again through different channels. From the OKW, from the SS liaison officers, from Berlin itself. Execute the demolition. Each time, Choltitz acknowledged the order and stalled. He cited communication delays, lack of detonators, resistance sabotage, insufficient ammunition. Each excuse bought another hour. Each hour brought Allied tanks closer. It was a dangerous game. Within the German system, delay could be fatal. Officers who hesitated were replaced, or worse, reported to the Gestapo. But in those final days of August, the chaos of retreat gave him cover. Lines of authority were collapsing. Messages took hours to confirm. The Reich was too busy dying elsewhere to notice one general's quiet disobedience in Paris. Still, the tension was relentless. The engineers waited for instructions. The SS demanded action. The French uprising grew louder outside his windows. At any moment, a fanatical officer could decide to obey the Führer's command without waiting for permission. One wrong move, one explosion, and the whole city would vanish. And then, another call came, not from Berlin, but from the approaching Allied lines. It was word that Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division was nearing the outskirts of the city. Paris would soon be surrounded, its fate sealed one way or another. The next time Hitler's voice came over the wire, the question was the same, but the answer was already decided. No, Paris was not burning, and as long as Choltitz controlled the detonators, it never would. The Führer's patience was running out, but as the German command demanded fire, thunder from the west was growing, the sound of French tanks on the march. By dawn on August 25, 1944, the sound of gunfire was no longer distant. It was inside Paris, echoing off Haussmann facades, ricocheting through courtyards, overlapping with shouts and bells. From the windows of the Hôtel Meurice, the German general could see smoke drifting above the rooftops of the left bank. The war had entered the city itself. Telephone lines flickered alive with contradictory messages. Some units reported surrendering to French forces. Others begged for permission to withdraw. The SS demanded that the bridges be destroyed immediately, accusing the army of cowardice. No clear chain of command remained, only fragments of obedience still loyal to a collapsing empire. Von Choltitz walked to the window and looked across the Tuileries toward the river. He could see the Pont Royal, still intact. Beneath it, barges drifted lazily on the Seine, as if unaware that they were floating over enough explosives to shatter the bridge into dust. The decision was no longer theoretical. Every fuse was ready, every charge wired. All it required was his authorization. He had spent his life executing other men's orders. He had seen entire cities destroyed in the name of duty. He knew that obedience could be justified with a single phrase: "I was only following orders." And yet, here, in the city that represented everything civilization could be, that phrase suddenly sounded hollow. He thought of the German engineers waiting for his signal, men who had built the charges carefully, respectfully, believing they were protecting their homeland. He thought of the civilians outside, who knew nothing of him and would curse his name forever if he obeyed. He thought of his own family in Saxony, who would pay the price if he disobeyed. And he thought of the voice that had asked, again and again, "Is Paris burning?" There are moments in history when silence carries more power than speech. Von Choltitz lifted the receiver, held it for a moment, then set it back down. He issued no order. Outside, the rumble of approaching tanks grew louder. The French 2nd Armored Division was now within the heart of the city. Resistance fighters guided them through side streets toward the Préfecture de Police. where a tricolor still fluttered defiantly above sandbags. The uprising, once fragmented, was converging into a single, unstoppable current. At 3 p.m., French forces reached the Hôtel Meurice itself. Through the doors came an emissary from General Leclerc, demanding the unconditional surrender of the German command in Paris. Von Choltitz agreed to meet. He left his headquarters under guard and crossed the short distance to the prefecture. The streets he passed were unrecognizable, crowds cheering from windows, nurses tending to the wounded, flags blooming like sudden flowers from balconies. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and liberation. Everywhere, people were shouting the same word, liberté. In a small office inside the prefecture, under flickering electric lights, the German general sat down across from General Philippe Leclerc and Colonel Henri Raoul Nordling, the communist leader of the Paris resistance. Two men who had fought each other only days earlier now faced their enemy not with hatred, but with the weary understanding that the war in Paris was over. Papers were produced, a brief document, typed and waiting. The German garrison of Paris surrenders unconditionally to the Allied forces and the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur. Von Choltitz read it once, set his pen to paper, and signed his name. It was a signature that defied his Führer and saved a city. When the announcement spread through the streets, the reaction was instant. Crowds poured into the boulevards, soldiers wept openly, and the bells of Notre-Dame began to ring, not for mourning, but for rebirth. Paris, the city that had been condemned to ashes, was alive. Inside the Meurice, demolition teams quietly disarmed the charges. Explosives were removed from beneath bridges, stacked on quays, and carted away under armed supervision. The most beautiful city in Europe had survived its trial by fire, not through miracle or luck, but because one man chose restraint over rage. Von Choltitz was taken into custody as a prisoner of war. He knew that Berlin would brand him a traitor. He also knew that history might remember him differently. As he was led away, he passed through streets that only hours before might have been his tomb, streets that now echoed with music, laughter, and the thunder of bells. He did not smile, but those who saw him later would say that his eyes looked oddly clear, as if, for the first time, he could finally see. The city was free, but liberation carried its own price. The German general who saved Paris would live to see his motives questioned, his loyalty condemned, and his legacy rewritten again and again. For Dietrich von Choltitz, the war did not end with the signing of a surrender. It simply changed shape. Hours after the formal capitulation, he was escorted from the Hôtel Meurice under armed guard and placed into Allied custody. The crowd that cheered Leclerc's tanks now turned their rage toward the last German general of Paris. To them he was still the occupier, the man who had ruled their city under the swastika, who had ordered arrests, who had enforced curfews. Few knew or cared that his refusal had saved the very streets they stood on. He was taken first to a temporary holding area at Rennes, then transported to a prisoner of war camp in England. From there he would spend years in captivity. His title was gone, his army gone, his country divided between victors. In interrogation rooms, Allied officers questioned him about his actions. They asked why the bridges had remained standing, why the Eiffel Tower had not fallen, why the city had survived. He replied in calm, measured tones that he had deemed destruction militarily useless, that the order, though clear, would have caused unnecessary civilian casualties. He spoke not as a hero, but as a soldier explaining logic. When pressed about Hitler's command, he did not deny it. He simply said, "I received the order, and I did not execute it." It was an answer that puzzled even his interrogators. They had met hundreds of German officers who insisted they had only followed orders. Here was one who had disobeyed and yet did not seek moral credit for it. He claimed no revelation, no epiphany, only exhaustion. He said he had seen too much destruction to add one more city to the list. Outside his cell, Europe was rebuilding itself from ash. The cities he had once fought over were now graveyards of stone. And in that silence, the question began to circulate. In newspapers, in cafes, in the offices of historians. Had a Nazi general really saved Paris? Or had Paris simply been lucky? For years, the answer was unclear. Many argued that Choltitz had exaggerated his defiance, that the German army no longer had the means to destroy Paris even if it wanted to. They said the explosives were insufficient, the engineers scattered, the communications broken. They argued that his surrender was pragmatic, not moral. Others pointed to evidence that contradicted that cynicism. The detailed demolition plans recovered from German archives, the crates of explosives found wired under bridges and monuments, the eyewitness reports from French engineers forced to assist in the preparations. The city had been ready to die. What stopped it was not chance but hesitation. One man's decision to leave the order unspoken. In Germany, that hesitation earned him no honor. The Nazi regime called him a traitor. Propaganda dismissed him as a coward. His name was quietly erased from Wehrmacht communiques. His family faced scrutiny and suspicion long after the war. Among his peers there was no celebration, only silence. In France, his story was received with confusion. He was an enemy who had spared their capital, but he was still the face of occupation. When journalists asked Charles de Gaulle whether Choltitz had saved Paris, the general replied coolly, "No, Paris saved itself." De Gaulle was not entirely wrong. The resistance had risen first. The people had endured. The French soldiers had fought their way in. But even de Gaulle understood that one German order could have undone it all. History is rarely the work of one man, but sometimes it is the restraint of one that prevents catastrophe. Choltitz remained a prisoner until 1947. When he was released, he returned to a shattered Germany, divided by occupation zones, haunted by guilt. He lived quietly in Baden-Baden with his wife and children, rarely giving interviews. When he did speak, his words were simple. "I was given an order to destroy Paris, and I did not do it. That is all." He never joined veterans organizations, never sought recognition, never claimed heroism. Those who met him in later years described a man courteous but distant, a soldier who had learned that victory could sometimes mean refusal. In the decades that followed, the myth and the man diverged. To some, he was the reluctant savior of Paris, proof that even within the machinery of dictatorship, a human conscience could still act. To others, he was merely pragmatic, a professional soldier who understood that the war was lost and chose survival over ideology. The truth likely lies between the two. He was neither saint nor monster, only a man at the intersection of obedience and conscience, who in one moment of clarity understood that duty without humanity becomes self-destruction. By the time he died in 1966, few outside military historians remembered his name. Yet every evening, when the lights of the Eiffel Tower shimmer across the Seine, they illuminate a city that might have been a memory. And somewhere in that glow lives the consequence of one man's decision to pause, to delay, to disobey. Paris had survived its sentence, but history still had to decide what its survival meant. To understand the full magnitude of that act and what might have been lost, we must look at the city itself. When the order reached Paris, burn it, leave nothing standing, it was not an order against stone and steel alone. It was an order against 5 centuries of civilization. The demolition plans were methodical. Each bridge across the Seine, Pont Neuf, Pont Alexandre III, Pont de l'Alma, was to be wired with explosives. The Louvre, the Palais Garnier, the Sorbonne, the Assemblée Nationale, all listed as potential strongpoints to be leveled. Even Notre-Dame had demolition sketches drawn for its towers and flying buttresses. The German engineers, precise to the end, had catalogued which charges would collapse which spans, which walls, which vaults. Had the fuses been lit, the Seine would have become a black river of fire. Its bridges would have fallen into the water like ribs of a broken spine. The Tuileries and the Luxembourg Gardens would have burned until nothing remained but soil and ash. Art older than nations would have been vaporized in minutes. Canvases that had survived revolutions, sculptures that had endured monarchs, manuscripts that had outlived empires. An entire language of beauty would have disappeared in one afternoon. Think of what that loss would have meant in 1944, when half of Europe already lay in ruins. Warsaw was rubble, Rotterdam was ash, Dresden had yet to burn but would soon. The world had begun to believe that destruction was the new normal, that civilization itself might not survive its own machines. And then came this single refusal, quiet and unseen, that preserved a reminder that not all beauty had to die with the century. Every bridge that still spans the Seine today, every street where tourists walk, every cafe where language and laughter mix, exists because one order was never spoken. The survival of Paris gave Europe proof that mercy was still possible, even in an age that had forgotten the word. After the liberation, when engineers inspected the hidden explosives, they found that the charges were real and primed. Had the detonation code been sent, nothing could have stopped it. The Eiffel Tower, once a symbol of modern triumph, would have collapsed into molten iron. Notre-Dame's stained glass would have burst into a storm of color and dust. The Louvre's canvases, Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Vermeer's Lacemaker, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, would have turned to flame. All of it was seconds away from extinction. Because von Choltitz paused, the city endured. Because he hesitated, millions would one day walk its streets without knowing how close they came to walking through a wasteland. The decision was not grand, not cinematic. No declaration, no banner, no hero's speech. It was a man staring at a telephone, choosing not to speak. And sometimes that is enough. History remembers acts of courage that shout, but it rarely remembers the ones that whisper. In the summer of 1944, the world saw cities vanish by the hour. Warsaw crushed beneath its own resistance, Dresden to come, Stalingrad already a grave. Amid that collapse, one city refused to disappear, not by victory, not by luck, but by a hesitation that rewrote what duty could mean. For decades, the story of Dietrich von Choltitz remained clouded by debate. Some called him pragmatic, others called him cowardly. A few, fewer than he deserved, called him human. But the truth is simpler and heavier. He was a man who obeyed until the moment obedience lost its meaning. He had spent his life inside a system that demanded absolute loyalty. He had watched comrades die for hesitation, families punished for dissent, civilizations erased by command. Yet at the very end, in a gilded hotel room above the Tuileries, he broke the one law that had defined him. He chose silence over order. He chose life over obedience. And because of that, the lights of Paris still reflect in the Seine. Nighttime footage of bridges glowing, traffic moving like veins of light, the Eiffel Tower shimmering at a distance. The legacy of that choice extends beyond a single city. It lives wherever power demands blind obedience, wherever men and women stand between command and conscience. It reminds us that history is not written only by those who fight, but also by those who refuse. When asked years later whether he considered himself a hero, von Choltitz replied quietly, "No, I just couldn't see the sense in destroying such beauty." It was the understatement of a century. Because of that modest refusal, Paris became more than a city that survived the war. It became proof that civilization itself could survive barbarism, that even inside the machine of total war, a single decision could still affirm what humanity means. Orchestra swells slowly. Bells of Notre-Dame faint in the distance. On August 25, 1944, as the tricolor rose again above the Hôtel de Ville, the people of Paris sang La Marseillaise for the first time in 4 years. Some sang through tears, others through disbelief. The bells of Notre-Dame rang until the ropes frayed, echoing across a skyline that was meant to be rubble. Every chime was a defiance of the century's darkness. Every note a reminder that conscience can survive command. And today, when night falls and the city glows from bridge to bridge, that light is not only electricity or architecture, it is testimony to hesitation, to mercy, to one man's quiet rebellion against destruction. Final sustained orchestral chord fading into the soft hum of city traffic, and the rustle of river water. Paris did not burn. And because of that, the world remembered that even in war, not every order must be obeyed. If you were moved by this story of how one decision changed history, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We uncover the hidden moments of the Second World War that the textbooks left behind. Acts of courage, mercy, and defiance that reshaped our world. Like, share, and leave a comment about which forgotten story you want us to tell next. This is WW2 Declassified, where history speaks in silence.